Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice. Hello, this is James, and welcome to episode 17 of the Mad in America podcast. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who's gotten in touch, either by email or by commenting on Mad in America. Your comments, feedback, and support are most welcome. This week, I'm honoured to have been able to interview Olga Runciman. Olga is an international trainer and speaker, writer, campaigner, and artist. She co-founded the Danish Hearing Voices Network and sees the role of the Hearing Voices movement as post-psychiatric, working towards the recognition of human rights while offering hope, empowerment, and access to making sense of individual experiences. Olga was a psychiatric nurse working in social psychiatry, but today she is a psychologist, and since 2013 she has had her own private practice in Denmark, working with people who have been labelled schizophrenic or psychotic. Olga is herself a psychiatric survivor and a voice hearer too. In this interview we discuss Olga's professional and personal experiences of the psychiatric system and how she now helps and supports healing and recovery in others. Olga, welcome. Thank you so much for talking with me today for the podcast. Firstly, I'd like to ask about you and your background and how you first came into contact with psychiatry.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. How did I get into contact with psychiatry? Well, actually, I was a nurse. I came to Denmark. I became a nurse. And I became a psychiatric nurse, and I became what they call a specialized psychiatric nurse here in Denmark. In other words, you're working there within psychiatry. Anyway, that's how I got into psychiatry. So I came in as a psychiatric nurse, and that was, many years ago. And I worked for quite a number of years as a psychiatric nurse. And at that time, I actually believed in all these sort of things that psychiatry taught us and told us about the science, and that it was a chemical defect in people's brains that was the cause of their madness and distress. And I actually have to say, because I've really been thinking about it lately, I came from the neurological ward. I actually was working in neurology before I came into psychiatry. And there we wouldn't dream of giving a diagnosis without tests. If you've got Parkinson's, well, you could go in and check that. Multiple sclerosis, brain tumors, all these sort of things. And then I came to psychiatry and I stepped into this world where there was no backup corroboration. It was just, you said, this person is suffering from this and this. And I think the world was so strange, the way I got introduced to it. And it was, I can see today that it is a crazy world we've created inside these wards, with the result that I completely somehow, and I think many people do, forgot to take sort of the common sense that I had from the neurology ward with me to ask, hang on, is there any evidence for what is being said here? And I think I got, I don't know what the right word would be, but conned in a way, I think perhaps because it's so huge. It's in the whole of the Western world, we find psychiatry. It's just so utterly unbelievable to think that it is not really science-based.
Thank you, Olga. It is quite shocking to realize how much of psychiatry seems to be based on faith rather than evidence.
Absolutely. And for me, I know we talk about that we shouldn't compare it to a religion, but in many ways, for me, this is our modern-day religion. Certainly in Denmark, people have moved away from the church. Many of the churches are empty today and stuff, and this is just, a modern-day, the scientific, if you like, religion. For people's distress. In the olden days, in the very olden days, people saw it in God's hands that we suffered like we do. Now we have psychiatry.
And Olga, I'm interested to know that kind of awakening that you had in seeing psychiatry for what it was it that led to your interest in activism and campaigning?
No, it wasn't. I'm a voice hearer. I've heard voices since I was a child, 4, 5, 3. So I can't even remember. I've had them in my world all my life. So I came into psychiatry as a voice hearer. I had experienced, like many people, I've had great difficulties in my childhood. Things have happened. I've been abused in my school. I was bullied, sexually abused in my school. There were many things that I carried with me, and I had these voices. Now I've had voices all my life, so I had incorporated them in my way of being. So when I came into psychiatry, and I'd learned by that time that hearing voices and things like that was absolutely a huge taboo. That was the primary symptom of schizophrenia. So I, of course, hadn't spoken about hearing voices to a single soul for many, many years. And, I used to manage my periods of distress so reasonably well, or at least enough to get educated and stuff. So no, I had all these voices. And when I came into psychiatry, I found myself questioning, because I met many people who heard voices and they were deemed schizophrenic, typically, and they were deemed incurable and seriously, seriously ill. And I would, as this nurse, go around and think, what's the difference between my voices and their voices, and why am I a nurse and they're considered schizophrenics? I had terrible dilemmas, actually.
I can understand that. And Olga, were your psychiatric colleagues aware that you were a voice hearer as well as being a nurse at the time?
Not at all. Right. Not at all. I kept, in fact, very few people really knew about it. In fact, probably venture to say that nobody did, because I just kept it to myself. I started in therapy, but even there I was kind of very quiet about that, because it was such a taboo. And because I worked in psychiatry, I realized that if this ever got out, the consequences were pretty dire. And I'd managed. I mean, I'd had these voices all my life. So, and I'd been fortunate. I'd been in Spain for a year, where I was in not a good space at all. And at that time, I was speaking aloud to my voices, and there were some people that asked me, why did I speak, to myself? And that was the first time I really realized that I was externalizing these voices, answering. And so I spent a lot of time making them, an internal dialogue. So I spoke with them just through sorts, or whatever one wants to call it. So nobody knew. What of course happened was that I got into a very bad period that absolutely escalated, where I was unable to use the tools I kind of had, and I did end up in the psychiatric system myself. So, and I have to say that is absolutely where I learned the very, very most, being a patient of the same system of which I've been educated within. Oh my goodness, it's not something I'd recommend, but I have to say, it truly is an eye opener to be inside, to experience both sides of that world. And I'm actually very grateful, because I'd never have educated myself within psychiatry. I never dreamt of going back and working in psychiatry. So it was good that in that sense, I was a psychiatric nurse, before I was deemed chronic, incurable schizophrenic, because that's given me access to both worlds.
Well, there are very few, Olga, that have had your experience of both sides of the story. And I wanted to ask, was your treatment voluntary, or was it forced on you, and were you medicated?
Oh, yes, I was. Originally, what happened was I began to suffer extreme anxiety. I was working at the time in the wards for the youth, teenagers and young people. And there were also, of course, many self-harming there. But I began to suffer extreme anxiety, and my voices were very, very bad. And I started to self-harm through burning my tongue. And I just couldn't understand why I was doing this. And I can see today, because it's many years and I've worked through an awful lot of things. But at the time, what was happening was much of my memories from the past, which I always had a theory, and I had that right from I was a child, very small, that if things were not put into words, they did not exist. And many things didn't exist because trauma, and especially sexual abuse, is something that's very secretive and doesn't often have a language anyway, and exists in limbo. So does it, did it happen? Does it happen? All these sort of things. So, but I think what was absolutely happening was that the words were coming, and I was trying to stop them. So I was burning my tongue to stop them. Only I didn't realize it at the time. I just got extremely distressed because I was thinking I'm going completely crazy here, and I had nowhere to talk and no one to talk with. But I had a friend who kept saying to me, you seem really bad, and maybe you should go to the psychiatric system. And I, being someone who worked in the system, came into a new dilemma because I discovered that I worked in a system that I didn't want to use myself. And then I thought, how can I possibly work in the psychiatric system if I don't want to use it? What am I offering? I mean, this is, and that's actually one of the things I talk about when I, for example, do training with staff. I often ask them to think about, would they use the ward that they work in? Would they themselves use it for their loved ones, their children, or whatever? Because that was a huge dilemma, a huge question that absolutely bothered me, and I had nobody to talk about it with, because I didn't want to. And I thought to myself, how can I possibly, do that to other people then? But she persuaded me one day to go over to the emergency, and there they talked. A psychiatrist met me and talked with me, and I remember he asked very casually, "Do you hear voices?" And I answered yes, and I thought, "Oh my God, what I said!" But he just noted it, and I was given a sleeping pill, and I spent the night there just in the emergency. And the next day, I could walk out. I said I was fine, no problem, and I started to live this compartmentalized world in reality, because at the time I'd gotten into the university. I was studying to become a psychologist. I had quit. I decided to quit my working and just go into the this pool system where people can call you. But I ended up working far more that way. And then I ended up having this really bizarre life, because sometimes I would be so distressed and couldn't sleep, and I would go over to the emergency because I'd get a sleeping pill and I'd sleep and leave. So I had this sort of compartmentalized life that nobody knew about. And then one day I met a psychiatrist who said that he thought I should spend the night in the closed ward, or where you're locked in. And I thought that was an incredibly bad idea, and said I found that this system that I had devised was perfectly adequate to just spend the night and get a sleeping pill. He didn't think so, so I was given the choice, which I always laugh at, these sort of ridiculous wordings. Or sometimes if we think about the language that's used, but I could choose between voluntary being admitted to the closed ward, or I could choose to be involuntary admitted. And anyway, there is no choice there. That is a true catch-22. So I chose voluntary, because I thought the lesser of two evils, maybe I can get out tomorrow. And I didn't. And I ended up spending more than half a year locked away in there. So that was the first time my family got to know about it. And my mom came over immediately. And as she came in the door to my home, the phone rang to ask if I could take a job, a shift. And my mom said, no, she can't, because she's locked in the psychiatric hospital. So I lost my job on virtually the first day.
I just wanted to ask, Olga, I've heard others describe being admitted to psychiatric hospital and undergoing months of treatment as deeply traumatic, and I wondered if that was your experience.
Very, because what happened was, when I couldn't come out, I ended up, I was put on vast numbers of drugs. They were changing all the time. For example, just to name one of them that I was put on, was this ghastly product called clozapine. It completely, absolutely handicapped me. I was so distressed behind this mask of just sitting like a zombie. because I was trapped in there. I would dribble. I remember I was just drooling. I became incontinent, which is a side effect that actually not many people know about, and I didn't as a nurse. So I was horrified. I thought, oh my God, my world is truly falling to pieces. I am truly insane. Plus, I also had my education, which told me that this thing truly existed, and I had no reason to question it. So I was desperate. I was so desperate. I was desperate to get out. My family were horrified. Their eldest daughter had gone completely mad. So I would do all these kinds of things. I'd be phoning, I thought, I've lost my job. And in my family, we need to find, if we work or study, then it doesn't matter how terrible things are. Then, on the surface, things are functioning. So I would be phoning, applying for jobs, and I figured, okay, I can't be a nurse right now. So I was doing, figuring cleaning jobs and, working in a cafe or stuff. And I would keep saying, I can't come right now, but, I'd be interested. And one time I phoned up, I didn't realize it was the hospital cafe. So they reported me. So I was given, I wasn't allowed access to the phone anymore. And, instead of asking, hey, Olga, why are you doing that? But this was seen as another sign of my insanity because I didn't have illness inside. So, and I can actually see in my journal that I tried to describe all these memories that were pouring forth about my past. But that became a tiny little sort of footnote. And I ended up very quickly, within 3 months, becoming completely focused on, oh my God, this cannot be true, that I'm ill and I'm going to be like this for the rest of my life, which is what they were trying to get me to accept, my illness or lack of illness inside. And that becomes my focus. And I lose focus on the original, why I even came into my distress, really. And I became focused on the hopelessness. Yeah. And the desperation that this cannot be true.
Well, the experiences you describe seem almost to intensify a person's isolation, when maybe people struggling need connection and human interaction, and they don't need to be physically isolated in hospital and chemically isolated with drugs.
It was, I can't say that the effects of the drugs, and I was on them for 10 years, in all different kinds of cocktails during many years, were horrifying. I love to read. For 10 years, I couldn't read. I'd read maybe a paragraph, and I couldn't remember what it was I was reading. People, I'd be sitting staring at the TV, and somebody would ask, "So what are you watching?" I wouldn't be able to tell them. I couldn't concentrate. To things like making a cup of tea, which is just the most natural thing. You just go in, put the kettle on, and a tea bag. It would be like I'd have to work out the steps. Okay, what is step number 1? So I actually ended up also being told that my illness was so serious that it was cognitively affecting me. Basically, I was becoming completely, they said mentally handicapped, stupid. But yes, and that was due to the drugs.
And Olga, how did you make that transition from inpatient psychiatric treatment to where you are now? You're an internationally known and respected activist, campaigner, speaker, and you help and support others. How did you make that transition?
Well, I made that transition basically because I think, just to say, I actually got crushed by psychiatry, as I did, because I fought for a long time with no illness sight and all this. But when we had this big meeting with my family, and it was a bigger meeting because they come from abroad, and they told me, and at that point my family supported my attempts to get out, and but they told my family while I was sitting there that I was incurably ill. I would never ever work again. I would never get better. I would need drugs for the rest of my life. I would need support for the rest of my life. And actually having them as witnesses to this disaster that unfolded, I stepped into this black hole, and I became one of those invisible patients, really, that never spoke, just sat around and said yes and agreed with whatever words were coming that way. And my family changed too. They went on, into eggshell mode. They didn't know what to do because they realized now that I was truly, because they believed it. And my way out was actually I planned suicide. And for me, this is a very big issue, really, because the story of hopelessness that psychiatry imparts or tends to instill in people, because when they say you have a chemical imbalance in your brain, you're seriously ill, it's in your genes and you'll never get better, this life that is then presented for you, kindly donated by psychiatry, is horrible. I just couldn't live that life. So I actually planned suicide. I planned it right down to the last detail, and I wrote a letter because I knew how upset my family would be, and I really wanted them to understand why I just could not live this life. But for me, I wrote in there, I have tried everything, and through this fog of these drugs and stuff, there was something about those words that kept coming back, and I suddenly realized actually what those words did for me was I hadn't actually chosen what I would do. And so I made a plan, and I didn't believe this plan because I'd never heard of anybody getting well. I completely entrenched in the belief system of schizophrenia and brain imbalances and all that stuff. So, but when I realized that I hadn't done that, I realized that I couldn't sign my letter and commit suicide on a lie in that sense. So I made a plan. And the extraordinary thing was this plan actually worked. So my plan was that I thought I'd never spoken about all these things that had happened to me. And that was the original thing that I'd come into psychiatry for. So I found someone, a therapist, a body therapist I could work with. I had a childhood dream of actually not being a nurse, but studying the stars, astronomy. And I found a course on that in the open university just to come there. It was actually in the planetarium. And because I thought I'm going to be one of those stars very soon. So I thought I'll just, do that. Then I looked at all my drugs and I thought I've taken all these drugs for so many years and been told that they help with the voices, and they've never helped one single bit. In fact, on the contrary, I've never had my voices so out of control. What it did do was I didn't care so much. Emotionally, I was completely blunted. And then I'd also put on an awful lot of weight. So I thought, okay, I'll do these things. I started to come off my drugs, which is probably the biggest thing. I found no literature on it, so I thought, well, what would I do? I thought, well, the people who are on substance abuse, they would use, withdrawal, go slowly. So I thought that. I looked at all the drugs and I thought, I'm going to do all of them in one go. So I just did, because I couldn't, all these things are working things out, and I was so fogged by the drugs, so it was just easier to do a tapering for them all. And that's what I did. And I have to say, my therapist there became my beacon of hope. She didn't realize there were two things I didn't talk to her about. One was the voices, because I considered them shameful and a sign of my madness. And the other one was my suicide plan. But what she became was she became my hope. And I found every time when I was thinking, is it now that I do it? I'd say, I can speak with her one more time. And I'd usually feel better after having spoken with her and put it off. And then one day I discovered that I'd woken up basically from my drugs, the drug stupor, and I began to have initiative. I began to want to do things. And this was completely and utterly new for me. I see my recovery, if you want to, and I'm so sick of the recovery cliche these days. I do feel it's colonized utterly. But but I went to a conference, actually. I was persuaded to go to a conference, and there was this guy talking about recovery, and that people could recover, because until then, even though I had gotten better, I thought it was like cancer. So I thought I had, I'd never heard of anybody and never met anybody who got well. So I thought, well, maybe I've got a couple of months, maybe if I'm lucky, half a year, and if I'm really lucky, a year. So I started to live life absolutely. Every time I found myself afraid of doing something, I jumped into it, because I said, I've only got maybe 6 months left. So, things like I wanted to learn to dive, And I thought, I'm not learning here in Denmark. The water's cold and murky. And so I went to the bank and borrowed a pile of money and went to the Caribbean and stayed there. Things like that, because I thought, and I was also told I had a new diagnosis. Of course, I was manic. But there was this guy, and he talked about recovery, and he said that it could be because of your life story and stuff. And I remember listening to him and thinking, oh my God, if those glasses, I sort of, those spectacles are right, the one he's talking about, that could mean that this state that I find myself in could be permanent. And that was a true life change, because until then I had my suicide package right there and had everything in place because the day that it would happen.
Well, your experience of finding that little chink of hope in amongst so much hopelessness, again, it's difficult not to use cliche terms, isn't it, Olga? But it genuinely sounded life-changing.
It was because every time I got anxious, or my voices became particularly aggressive, or stuff like that. Of course, I would think, oh my God, is it now? Is this illness that's out of control inside my body, awakening again? And when I realized that there's this was such a powerful message that I mentally just latched onto it and decided this is the way I'm going. And then, of course, and then I was so fortunate that, I got to read Robert Whittaker's Mad in America book, and that started me on the activism, really. Yeah. That was the book, because I read about that, and I read the whole book, and I thought, oh my God. And then I went back and reread it, this time looking at all the references, and it was like this motorway that I was stuck on with no exit sign. You were only fed all the time. Because I was at that point in time saying there's something really, really wrong with psychiatry here, and people were saying, "Oh, Olga, it's the right," and don't go into conspiracy theories, And I was, of course, terrified of being seen as mad again, But when I read that, then that was my start on activism.
It's so powerful, isn't it, to witness that so many other people have had similar experiences.
Well, this is it. I mean, I often think about the anti-psychiatry movement. That is a real, it's almost a swear word to say anti-psychiatry. And I think to myself, well, we say anti-psychotics and antidepressants. Why can't we use anti-psychiatry? I have no problem with using the word anti-psychiatry. I think it's perfectly fitting in many, many ways.
And Olga, I wanted to ask a little bit now about your activism and your writing. And you've talked and written of having a viewpoint that is post-psychiatry, and I wondered if you could help me understand how we support those in psychological distress in a post-psychiatric model.
Yes, it's kind of based on the postmodernism, but in reality, it's Pat Bracken and Phil Thomas, of course. Pat Bracken and Phil Thomas that wrote the book Post-Psychiatry, and both psychiatrists, but also very much into philosophy, both of them. For me, it makes post-psychiatry and the idea of post-psychiatry makes complete sense. It's part of the critical psychiatry network. And if we started with the anti-psychiatry movement, which came about in the heydays of the 60s and 70s, and also because psychiatry was unable at that time to define who was mad, who wasn't mad. The Rosenhan experiment, all these things that were occurring. There were many therapists, people beginning to go to therapy. Psychiatry was under tremendous pressure, and so that's when they created the DSM-3. Which went. Before that, they had a sort of a more, psychoanalytic. Many people went, so more in that direction. But after that, that was the start of the true biomedical model that really took off then. And in fact, it's very interesting reading about the history of how that is, where they looked at what can they do that's different to, say, psychologists or therapists. Well, we can have the white uniform and we can give pills. That's the difference. So let's focus on that idea. So that was that move. Now, one of the things that I think is also interesting, there was a lot of people that spoke for the mad people in the anti-psychiatry movement, and it was also an intellectual movement. But the mad people themselves, and I like to use the word mad, they were not part of that movement. It was still another group of people who were speaking on their behalf. this time from a sort of a different perspective. Anyway, the critical psychiatry came about mostly in the UK in, I think, 1999, particularly when the laws for coercion were being strengthened. And critical psychiatry is psychiatrists who are critiquing their own field, primarily the biomedical, model and the drug culture of psychiatry and coercion, of course. And post-psychiatry is on a continuum. So post-psychiatry would share all the things that critical psychiatry believes in, if you like, but they've gone a step further, because critical psychiatry is psychiatrists within psychiatry that are believing that change is still possible within the system. And many people fight for that and believe that change within the system is possible. Post-psychiatry, of which Phil Thomas and Pat Bracken, the most well-known psychiatrists in that field, talk about that they don't believe that is possible, and instead want to focus on opening up spaces outside of psychiatry. In other words, opening up many ways of and possibilities of healing, of looking at madness, and involving much more the community. And they are very adamant in involving the user and survivor networks. And in fact, both critical psychiatry and post-psychiatry, if you're not a psychiatrist, they do say, please join the Hearing Voices Network, because that's we support them, work together. So post-psychiatry is primarily about opening up spaces outside of psychiatry. It doesn't believe that there's a correct way of framing madness. And very much of it is, I feel, can go very much hand in hand with the Hearing Voices Network. For example, we create our own help system and self-help groups and ways of helping each other outside of psychiatry. And that's what we do in the Hearing Voices movement. This is what post-psychiatry is also advocating, that these spaces open up. And basically also, I'm very critical of psychiatry, but I don't say what psychiatry has to be, shut down. I think there is a place for it, but what I do want to see is that it has to justify itself like many other things, and that its dominance, and particularly its dominance in coercion. In fact, coercion has to be stopped. And one day, the day that people can have the right to say no to drug treatment and no to, coercion is not part of it, but it's just a possibility out of many possibilities that people can choose from, then I'm fine. But right now, how it is, no, its power must be taken away, and it must be put on equal footing along with many other help systems.
Well, Olga, it's so refreshing to hear you say that the best way to support people is to help them make sense of their own experience in a way that means something to them, rather than impose on them a diagnosis or a label or a particular way of thinking.
Yes, because psychiatry is actually is still stuck absolutely in the Enlightenment era. It still believes that the ultimate truth can be found. And, if you look long enough, you'll find the defect in the brain or the gene. And what that means is that we're producing endless amounts of research that is just numbers that dehumanizes the people behind all these numbers, and creates, because we're living in this scientific era where it's just sort of slotting in, it gives them the aura of knowledge and power. Or not that they have power, it's not just pseudo power. They have tremendous power, but they are also utterly. Well, I have no problems thinking of them as utterly corrupt. With the pharmaceutical industry, all our drugs have been created based on the effects. I did, when I wrote my thesis, I looked at, which is where I became very interested in post-psychiatry, I was looking at the subjectivity of taking psychiatric drugs as somebody labeled schizophrenic. For example, all the research, and I went through all the 5 databases from 1950 to the end of 2012, looking at what researchers actually involved those taking the drugs and their opinion and their experiences of taking the drugs. And I found 14. Now, I'm sure I've missed some, but even so, that is so tiny. It's just so, it might as well not be there. In other words, all our knowledge, our present day knowledge of how psychiatric drugs work is top down. It is people saying, this is how it works by looking at patients like a bug under a microscope. They're not part of this. And yet when you ask people, how are they actually experiencing the drugs, you can see that their descriptions fit completely with how psychiatrists originally viewed, for example, the neuroleptics in the 50s. It fits completely with that, where it was described as a chemical lobotomy. It was described as not helping with the psychotic symptoms, but just made them calmer. The side effects were such that they became so Parkinsonistic. It was at that time one believed it was an antagonist to Parkinson, so that they discovered that by making these people so Parkinsonistic and needing actual physical help, the staff became kinder towards them simply because, now they were so handicapped. All these sort of things. And this is how people describe them. So if you want to see when psychiatrists and patients were in agreement, you have to go right back to the beginning of this psychiatric drug revolution, which was in the 50s and early 60s.
That was a turning point, wasn't it? And Olga, can I ask what led to your work to set up the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal?
I was thinking, about one of the things that also affected me in my activism was when a young woman in one of my voice hearing groups dropped dead, and that was the first time I found out that so many people actually die from the treatment. At that point in time, I had just thought that people suffered permanent brain damage, but when I discovered that there was such a high death rate, that was also another thing that really propelled me into my activism and my focus on drugs, which has been probably my biggest. Well, I felt that's always been psychiatry's Achilles heel, and that's why I want to say that for me, one of my real pleasures and joys is to be part of a founding group of people who've started the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, that it's now becoming an official, and to shout from the rooftops that it's okay, to talk about drugs, which has been, the crown jewels of psychiatry, and is like swearing in the church if you say anything against them. So I want to shout from the rooftops, and I'm so happy to be part of a founding group of people who have started this institute up. Yeah, so things are changing, and we are getting more and more people are beginning to question psychiatry. So for me, I think the foundation of psychiatry, which is its pseudoscience, is truly cracking.
And Olga, I wanted to ask, what have your own experiences and the experience of those you support in private practice taught you about the way that we as society respond to emotional or psychological distress?
Well, I decided when I came out of the psychiatric system, because one of the things that I'd wanted to, or during all those years, was talk to somebody about my life, really. And I was told that as a schizophrenic, that would just make things far worse. And, I should maybe go and paint another painting or something. So when I came out, I decided I would become a psychologist for all those people that were told that they should never have therapy. So that's why I have started to work here in Denmark. And it can sound nice, fancy, to say I'm the first and only psychologist working with people in extreme distress in private practice here. They're psychologists employed in the hospital system, but they think they think in the illness model. So I'm the only one. And I still think it's a tragedy. I think how sad, But nevertheless, it is a huge gift for me. I can't say how honored I am to be a part of people's journeys and to try and be some kind of reflecting, teammate on their journeys. I find so many people when they come, the first thing they say is, "Oh my God, I've never been able to talk about these things without, being judged," and all the fearful things. And I've been there and I've done that with so much of it, and many of the things that I haven't tried myself. Now I have so many stories from other people that I can share their experiences. And I amazed. This is the first time, and I have to think back from when I originally started to work in psychiatry as a psychiatric nurse, where I was just reinforced in the hopelessness of and the incurability of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Because now, working the way I do, I meet people who are considered absolutely chronic, impossible. Some people don't even have a language that initially is understandable when I start to speak with them. And they end up getting their lives back. And not because I'm doing some kind of miracle, psychologist, bloody terror. I am listening to their stories. I am being a witness to their stories. And also, I have to say, at the same time, increasingly, and I help people off their drugs, I am actively promoting that to really get your life back for most people, getting off the drugs or getting to such a small amount, so that they can function is probably also a huge, not probably, I can see is a huge help. So that's what I do. And I see people getting better now in a way that I never, ever saw. And so I'm no longer just one of these rare people, because initially when I first got better, if you like, from psychiatry, I was also the first one to start verbally talking about it. And initially there was nobody else. And I used to think, is it really true what I've heard, that people do recover? I'd seen some other people in other countries, but now they're all over the place. We're so many that recover. When you leave, by the way, leave psychiatry. You have to leave psychiatry to recover, because you have to be decolonized, because I believe you become completely polluted by that way of thinking. And that is soul destroying. And so many people lose their lives because of that.
Olga, I want to thank you, because you mentioned earlier in the interview a particular therapist who'd become your beacon of hope. And you were a beacon of hope for so many through your activism, your teaching, your private practice too. So I just wanted to recognize that.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to say thank you to all the people, because if it wasn't for these wonderful people that I've been able to share my story and who shared their stories, and this worldwide network of people who are co-warriors, if one can say that, with me, I want to say there's hope. Truly there is hope. And that doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the horrendous suffering that people do go through.
Olga, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me for the podcast. It was an honor to be able to benefit from your experiences, and thank you for sharing them with me.
And thank you for doing this, because I think really these podcasts and things, they really get out to people. It grabs you in a different way. So thank you.
Mad in America News and Updates. On Mad in America, we wanted to give you some additional details about the upcoming series of webinars on psychiatric drug withdrawal. The first webinar will be held on October 24th, and the three panelists are Jocelyn Peterson, Dina Tyler, and Oryx Cohen. All three have extensive experience of psychiatric drugs and considerable experience helping and supporting those who wish to withdraw safely. The panel will be moderated by Mad in America editor Emily Shearer Cutler. The next webinar will be held on November 12th and is led by Dr. Sandra Steingard. Dr. Steingard will be discussing her journey toward a practice where research on long-term outcomes from psychiatric medications is taken seriously. She will present on the research that provides an evidence-based rationale for supporting patients to taper from antipsychotics. On December 12th, psychiatrist Dr. Kelly Brogan also presents her clinical experience working with patients withdrawing from psychiatric drugs, with an emphasis on the critical role of addressing the physical and emotional reasons that gave rise to psychiatric symptoms in the first place. She will provide a particular focus on anxiety and depression, as well as the psycho-spiritual underpinnings of the withdrawal process. She will describe her approaches in her clinical practice and her online healing community. Another international figure, Swedish therapist Carina Harkinson, will speak on January the 16th of her nearly 3 decades of experience, first as a founder of the Family Homes Foundation and now as a founder of the Extended Therapy Room, helping people taper from psychiatric medications. On February 20th, Dr. Peter Breggin will share his perspective on the hazards of long-term use of psychiatric drugs. He will show the compelling evidence base for psychiatric drug tapering protocols, drug withdrawal syndromes that patients experience when tapering from psychiatric drugs, the biological explanations for such syndromes, and patient-centered and controlled approaches to successful drug tapering and withdrawal. On March 20th, we hear from therapist Will Hall, author of The Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs. He will discuss how he works with individuals, families, and clinicians using a person-centered and flexible approach to drug tapering and withdrawal as a life-change and learning process. His presentation will include information on drug response diversity, crisis risk, and alternative responses to experiences seen as psychotic. Finally, on April 17th, there will be a closing webinar which will host a panel of people with lived experience of taking and withdrawing from psychiatric medications. They will review this first Mad in America withdrawal course, its strengths and shortcomings, and discuss an agenda for developing drug tapering knowledge and support programs. For more details and to sign up for this groundbreaking set of webinars, visit madinamerica.com and use the link at the top right-hand side of the homepage. So, thank you for listening, please come back next week for another episode, and until next time, take care. Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.